Many of those without IDs would have to travel great distances to get them, and some would struggle to pay for the documents they might need to obtain them. We call those poll taxes.
Welcome back. That was Eric Holder, the United States Attorney General, calling voter ID laws in Texas poll taxes. Today, the Department of Justice launched an investigation into Pennsylvania's voter ID laws, too. Republicans who passed these laws insist they just want a fair election. But now we've learned the attorneys defending Pennsylvania's voter ID rules have admitted there is no voter fraud. The state signed this stipulation saying there have been no investigations or prosecutions of in-person voter fraud in Pennsylvania. So the state says there is no voter fraud. They don't even know of any cases in other states either. Not one single case. But tomorrow they're going to trial to defend rules that could keep more than 758,000 people from voting. That's more than 9% of Pennsylvania's voters. The rules hit urban areas even harder. 18% of people in Philadelphia don't have state IDs. So if there's no voter fraud, why keep these Americans from voting? One of the state's most powerful Republicans explained his support of voter ID.
Voter ID, which is going to allow Governor Romney to win the state of Pennsylvania. Done.
It just don't get no clearer than that. They're trying to keep this from happening again. President Obama won Pennsylvania by about 650,000 votes. Keeping 750,000 people from voting won't stop non-existent fraud, but it could really help Mitt Romney on election night. I'm joined by Hillary Shelton, Senior Vice President for Advocacy and Policy and the Director of the Washington Bureau of the NAACP, and E.J. Dionne, MSNBC contributor and author of the marvelous new book, Our Divided Political Heart, being quoted by Bill Clinton. Mr. Shelton, are voter ID laws a modern-day poll tax, as Attorney General Holder suggested?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, if we look at how poll taxes were used in the past, we know that poll taxes were used as obstacles to prevent poor voters from being able to participate. Let's switch to today's voting processes. Under these photo ID laws, you now have to get a birth certificate, usually a certified one with the raised seal. In most states, that runs between $10 and $20. You then have to go to the motor vehicle office and get your official state photo ID, either driver's license or the state ID, in which case you're paying another $20 to $35. Indeed, now you're paying a price, a dollar figure, to be able to participate in the electoral process. It is indeed a poll tax.
E.J. Dionne, the Pennsylvania voter rights case could become a national test case. The plaintiff is a great-grandmother whose purse was stolen. Her name is Viviette Applewhite. She's African-American, and she's 93 years old. She can't get a copy of her birth certificate in time for the election. She marched with Dr. King and has voted in every election since Kennedy. Do you think the courts will side with her and let this poor woman and others like her vote?
Well, God bless her, and I hope the courts do. And I think one of the problems here is this is so blatantly political that the story is often covered in a political frame. It's good for the Republicans and bad for the Democrats. That's true. But that leaves out the fact that I think it's fair to say that this voter suppression across all these states is the biggest rollback of access to the ballot since the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the repeal of the abolition of the poll tax. I mean, you're talking here about the full Monty of voter suppression. It's not just the voter ID laws. In some states, you've had restrictions on voter registration. Other states, you've limited early voting, which has disproportionately benefited lower-income people who don't always have an easy time of it getting time off on Election Day. And so I hope these laws are exposed for what they are. If you live in the suburbs like I do, most people have to get IDs because you got to drive a car. A lot of people in the inner city do not drive cars and do not routinely get the driver's license, which is the common form of identification in the country. That's not fair.
Hillary, let's pick up with what the point EJ was just making. A lot of people go, look, I don't get it. $35, so big deal. People ought to just pony that up and then go on and vote. But what EJ has pointed out here is that extremely poor people or people who are not are urban but rural will have an extremely difficult time, even those people in urban areas. So explain to us why these prohibitions, so to speak, in these voting ID laws will turn negative against disproportionate numbers of poor people, working people, and African Americans as well.
We talk about people on fixed incomes. I call it in many ways the Katrina effect. When Hurricane Katrina hit, most people assumed that people would be able to hop in their cars and drive north. But what they didn't realize is 50% of all those people that lived in New Orleans didn't have a driver's license and didn't have a car either. As we talk about these issues, the presumption is because most middle-class people have cars and as such have driver's license. So doesn't everybody else? The short answer is no. 25% of African Americans throughout the country of voting age do not have the requisite photo ID to be able to participate in this upcoming election. That indeed is voter suppression at its highest level.
Right. EJ, in the last year, 18 states have either passed or have pending voter regulations. Why is this happening right now? Is there some happenstance going on, or is there some deeper political rationale and logic to why it's going on right now?
Well, part of it is that you have Republicans taking full control in a lot of states and a much more ideological and aggressive Republican Party right now. And they've also been laying the groundwork for this. Republicans have been trying to make a case that there is massive voter fraud all over the country for the last decade. And they haven't made the case. It's very hard to come up with more than a handful of cases. But they've just repeated it and repeated it and repeated it. And the repetition now serves as a rationale for laws that we don't need and that actually have the effect of suppressing some people's votes, minorities especially, lower-income people, and young people. I'm also struck with the unfairness inherent in some of them. In Texas, you can use a concealed carry permit, but you can't use a student ID. Does that mean the state of Texas suggests that all lower-income people be armed so they can go to the polls? There's just something very peculiar about that.
Very peculiar indeed, that peculiar institution about which a historian wrote that has its devastating consequences on us now. Hillary Shelton and E.J. Dionne, thank you so very much.
It's great to be with you.
There's a lot more coming up in the next half hour on The Ed Show. Stay tuned.
Ooh, chicky, chicky, chicky. Ooh, chicky, spring chicky.
The Muppets are joining the mayor of Boston in protesting the Chick-fil-A position on gay civil rights. The big panel weighs in next. And sales of firearms skyrocket as the backlash against the NRA grows in the wake of the Aurora shooting.
The NRA is the enabler of death. Paranoid, delusional, and as venomous as a scorpion.
Tonight, the story of how the NRA went from a sportsman's organization that supported gun control to the militant political group it is today.
From my cold, dead hands.